One of the things that's been talked about is how public the Queen was, but how little we knew about her in private. The mystique of the monarchy, the enigma of the woman. Amazing, we think, she probably knew, of course, that she was ill towards the end, but managed to work right up into her penultimate day on earth. And we saw those images of her swearing in Liz Truss, or the kissing of the hands they call it in the UK, with a radiant smile on her face. Someone who can help us perhaps understand the enigma of Her Majesty is India Hicks, designer, former model, mother of 5, also impeccably credentialed to give us unique insights into the royal family. Her mother, Lady Pamela Hicks, held the trusted position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth. Her late grandfather, Lord Mountbatten, was especially close to the King, not only as his godfather, but as the man he calls the grandfather he never had. And in 1981, she served as a bridesmaid, or a flower girl perhaps, to Lady Diana Spencer at her wedding to Prince Charles. She is also a goddaughter of the new King. I'm delighted to welcome India Hicks to the program. You have had an extraordinary life, and there's lots of elements I want to touch on tonight, particularly of relevance to Australians. But just before we do, an extraordinary visit yesterday and a wonderful reception for the King in Northern Ireland. Poignant and personal for you, given your family history, but that was a very significant event.
Yes, but a very necessary one. He is now King of the United Kingdom, and so he needs to be out and about, uniting us. And we've seen no better example of this unification than the Queen managing to time her death with her visit to Balmoral. She wanted to die in Scotland, and she did. And I think that no monarch since about 1870 has died in Scotland. And so that was just a wonderful unifying moment. And King Charles is doing what he now needs to do, which is also unifying us. The Irish visit is particularly poignant and important. I think one of the main highlights of the Queen's reign for her personally was that visit in 2011 to Ireland, where she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness. And I think that was a moment where we all realised, if she can forgive, we must all forgive.
You are watching, as we are, play out a very public mourning of a family that you know personally. Your mother, as I referenced, was with the Queen when she heard of her father's death.
That's right. My mother was a lady-in-waiting on both Commonwealth tours, and they had left on the first one. They knew that the King was unwell, but they didn't realise how unwell he was. So they set out for that Commonwealth tour, and they were in Kenya, and they were really in the depths of the jungle, so to speak, and they were up in treetops looking at wildlife. And the rest of the world heard the news of the King's death, and really the Queen and Prince Philip were one of the last to hear. But the extraordinary part that my mother always reminds me is that when they came back from treetops to Nairobi in order to fly back to the United Kingdom, the world's press had a chance to land there at that airport. And as a sign of respect for Princess Elizabeth in mourning, they put their cameras on the ground and no one took a photograph of her. Isn't that amazing?
It struck me, yes, there were people lining it with mobile phones, as we expect in this modern age. But cars stopped, motorists stopped on the road last night, and drivers got out and bowed their heads. I think there's a reverence that has now arrived in London as Her Majesty has come home, that perhaps was mingled with the grief and the shock in the last few days, but it's a very sombre mood today.
It is. I think it's also that the Queen has come home. She's travelled down from Scotland, and her family had her last night. But essentially, as of today, she goes back to the people. And it is very moving. And it's unprecedented what we're seeing, because there has been no monarch in any of our lifetimes who has had such a profound effect, not only on England, the Commonwealth, but the world. She set an example that few will ever be able to copy.
What's fascinating to me, and I worked in politics, India, before I worked in television, such a private person in a sense, didn't give interviews, we didn't know her political views on things, but she's owned by the world in many respects, and everyone lining up to pay tribute feels a personal connection in many instances to someone they never met and never heard from in terms of her views on issues that they might care about. Why is that?
I think it's part of the mystique of the royal family, the brilliance of the way she reigned. It will change now because Charles will reign in a different way. He's a different person. He has Camilla beside him, which is good, because he is very sensitive and she is very sensible, and together that will be a very powerful combination. But the Queen, for the most part, was so young when she inherited this role that she had to make her own way. Charles has had 73 years of apprenticeship, so he's ready. It was interesting, that speech that he gave, his first one, where he reassured us that he, as our king, would dedicate his life to the service that his mother had as well, to us all. But he mentioned putting his charities slightly behind him now, and that he would have to focus on other things. And I thought that was interesting. And as we know, he has been prescient in setting this example of environment and ecology before any of us thought in a sustainable or green way. He was doing that. So now he will have an agenda which will be to make the world a better place. He will be a modern king, I think, and will set this example again, different to his mother, but very powerfully needed for the time we have right now.
And let's not forget, I mean, you're his goddaughter. The godfather is the king. That's quite an elevation. He was involved in the Prince's Trust as a relatively young man, wanting to engage with vulnerable people, perhaps before others in the royal family thought that was a place that they should be involved in.
Well, again, it's not just he was involved with it, he created it. In 1976, he felt that the plight of the youth needed to have some help, some assistance, and he saw particularly marginalised youth. And so he began this trust, the Prince's Trust, which today is a huge global foundation, and I think Australia is very familiar with it. And the work that they do is extraordinary and astonishing. But he's always done it in a very quiet way. He's never sort of stood out and claimed to own it. He's shared it with so many. I'm very honoured to be a Prince's Trust ambassador. You have to work very hard for that. I have to continue raising money, raising awareness, working towards the end goal, which is to help those marginalised by society, particularly the youth. And again, I think it was very prescient that the Prince of Wales, now the King Charles, saw that really it's the generations behind us that are so important, that will keep us as a world moving forward to a better place.
And I'll say to my viewers at home too, the Prince's Trust has a heavy involvement in Australia, and we hope to see you there, I'm told, at the end of the year. There's a lovely, there's a sense of a great love match between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And in some of the floral tributes I read when I was out in the garden yesterday and the day before, you know, references to "now you're in heaven with your great love, Philip," and the Queen died perhaps of a broken heart, said some. There's a lovely exchange of letters between your mother and the Queen following the Duke's death. Are you happy to share a little bit of that with us?
Well, I think both my mother and the Queen were of a generation and an upbringing where it was easier for them perhaps to write rather than say what they were feeling, how their emotions were. They just weren't that upbringing, and that generation who've lived through a war were much more reserved in their emotions. They had to be, particularly as a monarch. And so my mother and the Queen would exchange letters quite often, and there was one wonderful letter between my mother and the Queen, because my mother inherited a racehorse, a retired racehorse that the Queen wanted to give to my mother because she needed to find a home for him. And my mother had many years with the horse, and at the end of his life, the horse's life, my mother wrote to let the Queen know, and the Queen wrote a wonderful, wonderful letter back. And it's just fantastic to have this communication between two women who were so passionate about animals and horses and horse racing, and that they were able to express themselves so clearly through that. But after Prince Philip's death, my mother was a first cousin to Prince Philip and really grew up with him. He always said that he was the Prince of No Abode. He wrote that in the guest books, and my grandfather really took him on as his uncle. And so my mother grew up with him, and when the Prince Philip died, my mother obviously wrote to the Queen a letter of condolence, and the Queen wrote back and said, I think you actually may have known him longer than me.
Ah, that's beautiful. Well, I look forward to seeing you in Australia at the end of the year. India Hicks, thank you for your time.
Thank you.